Every single flight begins with the same instruction, repeated so many times that most passengers no longer even listen to it. If the cabin loses pressure, put on your own oxygen mask before helping anyone else, including your own children. On the surface, it sounds almost cruel. Help yourself first. Watch your child struggle before you assist them. It is the one safety rule that seems to contradict basic human instinct. It is also, quite possibly, the most carefully justified rule in all of aviation, built on decades of physiology research, a string of eerily silent disasters, and a chilling discovery about exactly how little time the human brain has before it stops being able to save itself at all. This is the history of the oxygen mask. Long before commercial jetliners existed, the danger of thin air at altitude was already a matter of life and death, discovered not by airlines, but by military aviators. As aircraft during the early and mid-20th century began flying higher and faster, particularly during large-scale bombing campaigns that required aircraft to cruise at extreme altitudes to avoid enemy defenses, aircrews began experiencing a strange, poorly understood problem. Pilots and crew members would grow confused, uncoordinated, occasionally euphoric, sometimes losing consciousness entirely, often with little warning, and no clear physical sensation of struggling to breathe. Investigators and military physicians eventually connected these episodes to oxygen deprivation at altitude, and aircraft designers responded by building some of the earliest oxygen mask systems. Bulky, uncomfortable devices made of rubber and leather, connected by hoses to onboard oxygen tanks, required equipment for any crew member operating at height for extended periods. These early masks were crude by modern standards, difficult to fit properly, prone to leaking, and often uncomfortable enough that crews resisted wearing them consistently, occasionally with fatal consequences. But they established the basic principle that would eventually shape commercial aviation policy decades later. Sustained flight at altitude was fundamentally incompatible with unprotected human physiology, and any solution had to assume that the people needing oxygen might already be too impaired to solve the problem creatively on their own. To understand why this rule exists, you first need to understand what happens to the human body at cruising altitude. Stripped of the protection of a pressurized cabin, commercial jets typically cruise between 30 and 40,000 feet. At that height, the air outside is so thin that a human being exposed to it directly would lose consciousness within a couple of minutes, not because the air lacks oxygen entirely, but because there simply is not enough atmospheric pressure to force sufficient oxygen into the bloodstream through the lungs. The body does not suffocate in the way people imagine suffocation working, with a gradual, obvious struggle for breath. It fails quietly, from the inside, often before the person experiencing it even realizes something is wrong. This condition is called hypoxia, and it is deceptively dangerous precisely because of how it feels. Reduced oxygen to the brain frequently produces something closer to euphoria than panic in its early stages, a lightheaded, almost pleasant confusion, similar to the effects of mild intoxication. Pilots and researchers have long documented cases where trained professionals, fully aware of the dangers of hypoxia in theory, calmly continued performing simple tasks incorrectly, smiling, entirely unaware that their judgment had already begun to fail. The brain, starved of oxygen, does not sound an alarm. It simply becomes worse at recognizing that anything is wrong at all. Aviation physiologists have a specific term for the amount of time a person can still think and act usefully after cabin pressure is lost. Time of useful consciousness. At cruising altitude, in the event of a sudden depressurization, that window can be as short as 30 to 60 seconds, not minutes, seconds. After that brief period, a person's ability to reason, to solve problems, to recognize danger, or even to complete the simple physical task of reaching up, grabbing a dangling mask and pulling it over their own face, begins to rapidly disappear, even though they may still be conscious and moving. This is the detail that reshapes everything about how the mask rule should be understood. It is not a suggestion built around convenience. It is a rule built around a brutally short, unforgiving biological deadline, one that most passengers, understandably, have never been told the actual number for. Unlike engine failures or structural breakups, decompression incidents often produce almost no dramatic external signs at all, which is part of what makes them so unsettling to investigators. In several documented aviation incidents throughout the 20th century, investigators reconstructing what happened aboard an aircraft that suffered a sudden loss of cabin pressure found something deeply disturbing. Cockpit voice recordings, capturing crew members speaking normally, calmly, sometimes even cheerfully, in the moments after pressure loss, entirely unaware that hypoxia had already begun quietly stealing their ability to respond. In some of the most tragic known cases, aircraft continued flying on autopilot for hours after everyone aboard had lost consciousness, the crew and passengers having succumbed silently without ever fully grasping what was happening to them, long before the aircraft itself ran out of fuel and came down far from where anyone expected. There was no explosion, no fire, no obvious drama, in the way film and television usually depict aviation disaster. Just a slow, silent failure of the human body, invisible from the outside, and almost invisible to the people experiencing it from the inside as well. These incidents did more to shape passenger oxygen policy than almost any other category of aviation accident, precisely because they revealed how little warning a person actually gets, and how quickly the ability to help yourself, let alone anyone else, can vanish. Early passenger oxygen systems were fairly primitive, often limited to handheld masks stored in overhead compartments, requiring a flight attendant to physically distribute them to each passenger during an emergency, an approach that worked reasonably well at lower cruising altitudes, but became dangerously inadequate as jets began flying higher and pressurization failures could unfold within seconds rather than minutes. Engineers eventually settled on the drop-down design, now standard across the industry. Compartments built directly above each seat, containing masks connected either to a shared oxygen supply or, in many modern aircraft, to small individual chemical oxygen generators built into the housing itself. These generators work through a controlled chemical reaction, similar in principle to a slow-burning fuse, producing breathable oxygen for a limited period, typically around 12 to 20 minutes, timed specifically to cover the interval a pilot needs to bring the aircraft down to a lower altitude, where the outside air itself becomes breathable again without assistance. The system was deliberately designed to require zero coordination from flight crew during the first critical seconds. The moment cabin pressure drops below a set threshold, the compartments release automatically and the masks fall, whether or not a single flight attendant is even in a position to help. It had to work that way because the entire premise of the design assumed that within 30 to 60 seconds, nobody on board might be reliably capable of manually operating anything at all. This is where the design of the mask and the wording of the safety rule finally meet. If time of useful consciousness is measured in seconds, then any parent who instinctively turns first to secure a child's mask, however loving and understandable that instinct is, may lose the ability to finish securing their own mask before hypoxia takes hold. And once that happens, the parent is no longer capable of helping either of them. Both masks may remain unsecured, or worse, the parent may be too impaired to notice their own mask has slipped, all while still believing in the confused, euphoric fog of oxygen deprivation that everything is fine. By putting on their own mask first, a parent guarantees they remain capable, cognitively and physically, of then securing a child's mask correctly, monitoring it, and responding if anything goes wrong. The rule is not built around whose life matters more. It is built entirely around the brutal mathematics of the situation. One impaired adult can save nobody. while one oxygenated adult can usually save everyone nearby who needs help. It is, in a strange way, one of the most quietly compassionate rules in aviation, precisely because it sounds so selfish on the surface. Flight attendants deliver this instruction so many times over a career that it can start to sound scripted, almost robotic. Easy for a distracted passenger to tune out entirely while checking a phone or settling into a seat. Airlines and aviation regulators have spent decades studying exactly this problem, testing different phrasings, different tones of delivery, even different visual demonstrations, trying to find a version of the announcement that actually breaks through passenger inattention rather than blending into background noise. Some airlines have experimented with humor, some with unusually blunt language, some with video demonstrations designed to look nothing like a typical safety briefing, all chasing the same goal, making sure that in the 30 to 60 seconds that might one day matter, a passenger's memory of the instruction is not simply something about masks, but a clear, actionable sequence they can execute without having to think it through from scratch. Pilots themselves undergo far more rigorous training on this exact topic, including exposure to controlled low-oxygen environments during certification, specifically so they can personally recognize their own individual symptoms of hypoxia before it becomes dangerous. Every person's early symptoms differ slightly. Tingling fingers, tunnel vision, unusual euphoria, and pilots are trained to identify their own personal warning signs in a safe, supervised setting, precisely because relying on a generic checklist of symptoms during a real emergency, at the exact moment judgment itself is failing, has proven to be far less reliable. The chemical oxygen generator, hidden above every passenger seat, is, on its own, a small feat of engineering most passengers never think to question. Rather than storing pressurized oxygen gas directly, which would be heavier, bulkier, and considerably more hazardous to carry in bulk throughout a passenger cabin, most systems instead store the ingredients for a controlled chemical reaction. Compounds that, once triggered, generate breathable oxygen through a slow, self-sustaining burn, without needing a flame or external power source. Pulling the mask down and toward you is not simply a mechanical action to bring it closer to your face. On most systems, that motion is what triggers the reaction itself, starting a chemical process precisely timed to last just long enough, typically covering the several minutes a pilot needs to descend from cruising altitude to a level where the outside air becomes breathable without assistance. This is also why oxygen is not available indefinitely once the mask drops. The system was never designed to sustain passengers for a full flight, only to bridge the exact gap between the moment pressure is lost and the moment the aircraft reaches an altitude low enough that the emergency effectively resolves itself. Once that descent is complete, the entire premise built around seconds and minutes, rather than hours, quietly stops mattering. Somewhere along the way, the instruction stopped belonging only to aviation. "Put your own oxygen mask on first" has become one of the most borrowed phrases in popular language, quoted constantly in conversations about caregiving, burnout, parenting, and mental health, almost always used as a metaphor for the idea that a person who is completely depleted cannot effectively look after anyone else. Therapists, self-help authors, and workplace wellness programs have adopted the line so widely that many people now encounter the phrase in that metaphorical context long before they ever hear it recited on an actual flight, if they ever consciously register hearing it on a flight at all. There is something fitting about that borrowing, even if it strips away the specific, brutal physiology behind the original rule. The underlying logic genuinely does translate. A person who has given away every reserve they have left is rarely in a position to help anyone else effectively. Whether the emergency is a sudden loss of cabin pressure at 30,000 feet, or the slower, quieter kind of depletion that builds up over months of caregiving with no relief. The aviation rule just happens to be the one version of that idea, with an exact, measurable deadline attached to it, a number of seconds, rather than a vague sense of eventually running out. What makes the oxygen mask rule unusual, compared to almost every other safety instruction on a flight, is how directly its wording traces back to a single, specific, measurable piece of human physiology. The rule about exit rows exists because of evacuation studies. The rule about seatbelts exists because of turbulence injury statistics. But the instruction to secure your own mask first exists almost entirely because of one number. The vanishingly small handful of seconds the human brain remains reliably capable of complex decision-making once deprived of adequate oxygen at altitude. Every other detail, the automatic drop-down design, the chemical generators timed to a pilot's emergency descent, the repeated, almost hypnotic safety announcement, exists to work within that same unforgiving window. It is a rule written not around what feels emotionally right, but around what the body can actually still do, in the exact number of seconds it has left to do it. The next time you hear a flight attendant recite the instruction, secure your own mask before assisting others, resist the urge to tune it out, the way most passengers have trained themselves to do over years of repeated flights. It is not a formality. It is not a legal disclaimer read aloud to satisfy a regulation, buried in the same breath as instructions about seatbelts and tray tables. It is the distilled result of decades of physiology research, silent tragedies that unfolded without a single dramatic sound or struggle, and a chemical generator engineered to buy exactly enough oxygen for a pilot to bring a stricken aircraft back down to air. A person can breathe unaided. 30 seconds, sometimes 60. That is the entire window. The rule is built to survive. A number most passengers will go their whole lives without ever needing to know, hidden inside a sentence that sounds selfish on a laminated safety card, and is, underneath it, one of the most carefully considered pieces of advice you will hear all year, precisely because it was written for the version of you that has already, quietly, started running out of time.